Yes. All right. So we have ended your book. Where does that place us?
So my book is a book of poop jokes in philosophy and theology. That's really what it is, and that's how I'd hope to sell it. But the last two chapters for me are, despite having a couple poop jokes in them, are utterly serious in that what I think we've missed in the Christian faith is that the gospel, at least in part, addresses the question of unnecessary and even unjust suffering in the world. And it's not through the usual way of, say, what we become used to in someone like Moltmann, that God suffers with us. That may be true as well, and through Christ. I got no problem saying that, but God's, if you will, co-suffering with us doesn't actually do a ton for me. Just says, right. Awesome, you suffer too. Woo, we're all in this.
So I'm not sure I'd be quite so reductionist with Moltmann.
No, but I got like two.
I know what you mean.
No, there's something real to it.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. If you pair it along with the idea that God not only co-suffers with us, but is addressing the very suffering itself.
Yeah.
That's what I'm arguing Christology is all about. Suffering, if you will, is caused by a skewed world. It's caused through sin. It's caused through suffering emerges only because there is sin, destruction, chaos, and violence in this world. Mm-hmm. And so Christ, if you will, is addressing suffering by addressing the very principalities of darkness themselves, and in through the life, death, and resurrection. That's what I'm arguing at the end of the book. Mm-hmm. That Christ actually subsumes and reinvents death so that it becomes not merely the end of life, but the very ground of life as a relational life. No, you're fine. In and through Trinity. So that's what I'm arguing at the end of the book. It becomes really serious. And this is in some ways, Hart's book, Hart's work had already inspired me to some degree, but I actually hadn't read Hart's book until after I had written this. And there's at least as I see it, and he might argue with me, I think there's a lot of commonality between us in that, for instance, he sees suffering not only emerging within the human realm, but within the realm of nature itself, saying that something is askew not only with us socially, but in the whole of the cosmic order, something has gone wrong. And he's going back to Greek roots there, and I fully affirm that about him and want to go there with him.
I agree with that.
So it's this is where the two books begin to. He addresses directly the idiocy, and I hate to use that term because the people who make these arguments aren't idiots, but the idiocy of the types of arguments we feel the need to make when it comes to suffering in the world and what it means.
Yeah, so I think the idiocy is not so much the people in themselves, but the it's a lack of understanding of what the Christian tradition is professing. And it's like, and this is, I think, one of the fundamental flaws, although to a lesser extent, with Nietzsche. It just doesn't stick with what Christian tradition has professed.
Yeah. Well,
right. So sort of a different. I'm going off of here right now,
Yeah, Nietzsche addresses the concrete Christian situation that
in a search for like a historical Jesus.
Yeah.
He sort of goes. He almost baits process theologians.
Uh-oh. Is it doing it again?
No, I'm here.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I'm here. Yeah. He's like almost baiting process theologians. It's really funny.
That's funny. I never thought of that. Yeah. Nietzsche's funny, and Nietzsche is oftentimes in the background of what Hart writes, from what I can tell, because Hart has an appreciation for the type of atheism that emerges out of Nietzsche, an honest one that is aesthetic, one
not a Richard Dawkins atheism.
Not a Richard Dawkins, exactly. It's an aesthetic atheism that says the world you have created is absurd. It allows for no greatness. It allows for merely the profession of a frankly, dead Jew who probably deserved to die. That seems to be how Nietzsche argues, who transvalued values, and now we need to take them back.
Yeah, because the narrative of will to power is broken in Christ.
Exactly. That's
And
exactly.
that's where Nietzsche can't go, with us.
No.
It's if that were not true, Nietzsche, I think, would be a Christian.
Yeah. And was one studying as a Lutheran minister, right?
Yeah. No, but Nietzsche is the most adept Christian critic.
And just so people understand, will to power is simply this: life is about domination. And when I speak, for instance, and I profess to speak in truth, all I'm doing is actually somehow trying to dominate you, get you on my side so that I can garner, if you will, your resources. Or this is one particular interpretation of it.
Yeah.
What it also allows for is the emergence of great persons, and really great in the realm, not so much of, say, military might, but of art, so that you can have great artists, great productions, great works of art again, rather than constantly having to draw the dying Christ.
Make art great again.
Make art great again. That's right. But this is oftentimes this is behind a lot of, I think, rightly behind what Bentley Hart does, because look at the statement that I just made. Isn't that how we actually think? We usually think, unless we begin to train ourselves out of this again, we usually think that when someone is trying to speak to us, they're not speaking to us with the sensibility of truth. They're trying to sell us a bill of goods, and we have to figure out whether that will actually benefit us or not. Yeah. And even in benefiting us, how much will it benefit them and give them an advantage over me?
Right.
That's how we usually think. So there is no truth for us. There is opinion. And what I was calling mere opinion in an earlier lecture, rather than reasoned opinion, which is at least opinion on the way to truth, seeking it out, instead of merely seeing all of our talking as means of domination.
Right. So to put us on the right track here, we've now got this concept of God and Christ from your book, and we're moving to the question of Theodicy. So first, tell us what Theodicy is.
Okay.
And second, what is Hart's project here?
Yep.
Like, what is he doing?
You got it. So Theodicy is a way of dealing with the problem of evil in the world that answers, if you will, that both evil as real can coexist with a God who is, if you will, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, etc. So the all-good, all-powerful God that we usually think of, which I think is mistaken oftentimes, the way that we portray that. It's Jersey we oftentimes portray it, but we'll come back to that. One of the ways that we oftentimes do that is by saying, we talk about, well, Bentley Hart talks about it in terms of what he calls the universal harmony. So the evil, the suffering, the unbearable genocides that we see in this world, according to, if you will, a theodicy, someone who's arguing through theodicy, and there are different types of theodicy, they're going to argue that these were, if not necessary, well, at some level, necessary events for God to bring about a universal and benign harmony in this world. So they had to be. And Bentley Hart's project in this book is to point to the absurdity in these types of statements, such that he's asking, can you actually reconcile the living, the dying, and the resurrecting Christ with that kind of statement? Did Christ come and then will that the children who are caught up in this tsunami should have died? Was this really necessary for the salvation of this world? Because if it was, it's very difficult to tell, to distinguish between God and a demon, if you will.
It's also very difficult to preach the gospel, if that's true.
That's right. So when we say everything happens for a reason, that's sort of the common way that we say it. Everything happens for a reason.
I hate that.
I do too.
hate that.
I've even said it before, and it
I
helps.
also just like it. It's like every phrase that is like that, and especially the ones that we attribute to God, frustrate me infinitely.
I know.
Uh,
Yeah, because what it means, or I have some colleagues and friends who have lost children, and when we say that everything happens for a reason, what we're affirming is that God took the wonderful and beautiful life and love out of this world,
right.
for some unforeseen and unknown reasons that the ends of which only God can grasp.
Right. That's just, and and I'm not attempting to be dismissive of this, but it does, like it does something to God.
Yeah.
God. That is wrong.
What it does, I had a Facebook post the other day, and it was trying to be silly, but it was serious nonetheless, where when you start talking this way, what you do is you project and understand God as the very source of evil itself. Because who causes these things to happen? Well, God does, right? And they're evil, but then we got to say, but they're only evil on their face. They're not actually evil because God is using them to bring about some universal harmony, some perfectly benign state that depended on the death of these children to bring about.
Right.
And Emily Hart saying, whoa, you've put the cart before the horse. Yeah, God uses evil, if you will, to draw out good things. We would be hard to deny that. It's just that God never wanted those evil things to happen in the first place, and is having to draw out good things that already should have been there despite the evil emerging.
Sure.
So it's as if, like a dying child, somehow we become stronger in and through. No. It's just tragedy. It is just tragedy, and that's maybe one of the effects of this. We have to accept just tragedy, something that never should have happened, something by means of which the world is a lesser place because of it, and yet with the hope and faith in Christ that not that Christ will use that particular event, if you will, but that God is reforming this world so that those events will never happen anymore.
So there are two things for this. This goes back to the discussion of the very origin of evil. Where evil first, steps foot into the created goodness.
Exactly.
So I do want to touch on that.
For sure.
But I also, one of the things that Hart says in Beauty of the Infinite, is that like one of the most comforting things about the gospel is that I know when I look in the eyes of a dying child, like I do not see the face of God.
Exactly. Yeah, that's in Doors of the Sea, actually. That's
Oh, is it?
Yeah, you've just been reading too much Hart.
I've been reading too. Yes, I guess I've been confused.
That's not a bad thing.
He does do a lot of this, suffering, evil.
He does
problem in Beauty of the Infinite too. So yeah, sorry, that's my bad.
Oh, you don't have to apologize. It's one of the most beautiful lines I think he's ever written, and I couldn't.
Absolutely.
And what he said, and that's in part 2 of this book, and what he's saying in that is that when you look at a dying child, you don't need to go through the mental gymnastics of saying God willed it. And this is somehow for the good of this world, bringing about some universal harmony or order or some sort of justice that we'll find at the end of time. We don't need to go through that mental gymnastics. We can actually look evil in the face and see it for what it is. A nothingness, a nihil, a void that has emerged that draws us into death and decay that ought not to have been here. And when we see the child who dies, we see that child fall into chaos. And our hope should not be in the hope that God is using that for some ultimate ends, that God had to have the death of the child. Our hope should be in the fact that God is dealing with the problems of death, violence, destruction, and evil itself, so that doesn't continue to happen.
Yeah. Um. So so where does evil enter into the story?
Well, I mean, that's the
So that's like the perennial question.
oh, for sure.
And that is I think that's the question from which all theodicy spawns.
It does. And in some ways, one of the trite things I think about Theodicy is that it only deals with the problems of human evil.
Mm.
And because it's actually human evil is smaller, despite the genocides, which I'm not making light of, human evil is smaller because we're a small part of this cosmos. Um, but at least the implication in this book, and I happen to agree, or don't happen to, I affirm this through Christology, is
Let me wait. Can I pause you for a hot second? You said Christology, and I was just thinking, and it just made me think about Trip. And how, and I actually, at the beginning of our conversation, you said Christology, and I was like, oh man. And I went on Facebook and friended Trip Fuller.
oh, I love it. Yep.
So we'll see at the end of the day whether or not, he accepts that friend request.
We'll see it. We'll see if he sees it.
Yeah.
I'll put in a word for you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, we had a nice little conversation. I mean,
No worries.
I think,
The
I think he lies to himself when he says he has a high Christology, but anyways, um,
no,
that's just me. Yeah, anyways, continue. I just needed that little anecdote.
no, totally fine. Evil in the world. It's we always pin it on ourselves when we talk about original sin,
Mm-hmm.
as if you will, the fall of persons. But what we oftentimes neglect, and Augustine doesn't neglect this, even in the Western Church where we are most apt to make these types of statements, Augustine doesn't neglect that it's the serpent, if you will, who brings in the temptation in the first place, and the serpent as a representation of Satan. So my cosmology and my harmatology, which is my study of sin, have brought me back from beyond the grave of talking about things like Satan, and made me recognize that I have to talk about things like Satan very, very uncomfortably. Don't like to, but it becomes a necessary part of the Christian traditional Christian theology, precisely because it's satanic, the satanic that is somehow the ground of evil.
Yeah,
That
if you want to be, a good contemplator of the Christian faith, you have to think about sin.
You do? Yeah. For me, it was a personal issue. I come from a Pentecostal tradition, and so, again, this is not to dog that tradition in the least. I've taken many great things from it, but Satan is in some ways trivialized, as if Satan cares about whether or not you're going to eat that pork rind. And I always had that caught up with the talks of Satan. But when you draw Satan into this sort of, if you will, cosmic, I don't want to say battle, that makes it sound Zoroastrian, but some sort of cosmic disarray, all of a sudden, it becomes a very, very, it becomes very important. So where does it come from? Ultimately, what does traditional Christianity affirm about sin? Well, it's a rejection of the order of God. That's what I would say traditional Christianity says about sin. And as a rejection of the order of God, it's also a positive, and primarily a positive taking up of oneself and one's own order. Mm-hmm. So I reject the world as it was created and it was supposed to be good. And I say, yo, God, I could do this better, man. And right. This is where sin emerges, where I take a lesser good to be the greater good, and then the world, if you will, because of its interconnected nature, falls into disarray because of one, if you will, one creature's insane conjecture that she was better than the divine. Actually,
we should caution ourselves and caution anybody who's listening to this against thinking, that this is some sort of utilitarian calculus. Like, that creation, um, even if you acknowledge that it is a given good, is like the best of a certain number of possibilities,
Sure.
you know? And, I think those two claims are incompatible.
Sure.
But, just we can't allow ourselves to think like that.
No, I don't think so. I think we have to see that God created a world with freedom, yes, and we'll talk about free will, I think, next time.
Yeah, so does God in creating freedom create evil?
Creates the potential, but you have to understand, so we have to define evil correctly here. Because evil is not but choosing what is worse over what is better, a lesser good over a greater good. So that's what I was getting at prior to what I was saying. Evil's not a thing. In classical Christianity, evil's not a thing. It's actually nothingness.
Yeah.
Or if we're going to talk about pure evil, it's pure nothingness, which means it's nothing unto itself. And what it is it's like cancer. Cancer uses all the cells within your body to create something that's malignant and eventually draws you into death. But it's not necessarily something unto itself. Rather, it is a privation of who you are and what you're supposed to be. Think of losing a limb.
Sure.
Military losing a limb. That's an evil because that limb is supposed to have been there.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk evil, what we're actually talking about is a contrast. The only way we can discuss evil is by discussing how the world should be in the first place. And we're given a primary look at how the world is supposed to be in those initial Genesis stories, both the first and the second creation accounts, where everything is drawn out, ordered, and engraced with God's divine goodness. Even God comes and breathes into the very dust of the earth itself to create this strange capstone of creation called humanity. But when things go awry, that order is lost and things fall into death and decay. So you see in the scriptures, for instance, you see that the elongated lives begin to shrink, right? This is a metaphor.
Yeah.
You have people living to 1,000 years old.
Right.
Oh, dude, that's okay. Come on now.
Right.
But this is a metaphorical way of talking about if you will, the effects of sin and death in the world. That the further we move into our own myopic worlds and away from the divine order that God created that was good, the closer we move toward our own death and demise. Which, if you will, we take this as God's willed consequence for us, as if God is standing up there as a judge is juridically demanding that we die for our sins. It's better actually to think of it as a natural consequence. Mm-hmm. Here's what I mean. If God is life itself, if God is the very act of being, if God is the one through whom and in whom we live, move, and have our being, then to choose something other than God is to choose something that is intermixed with the nothingness from whence everything is created. So we've given ourselves over from the infinite source of life to that which is finite, which has a natural propensity to fall into death and disarray.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot on everyone's plate right here.
Yes. I'm trying to sort of place myself outside of my own mind and my own theology right now. And ask the questions that I know certain people would ask of this. So in some sense, then isn't I want to say that freedom isn't is not anything except for in its use. There is no object that is freedom as such.
There is God,
except for God. Yes. In the human realm. For us, like if I were to say, "Oh, this is freedom," I would be wrong unless I was talking about God.
Yep.
And it, in some sense, doesn't that make God responsible for freedom's use?
Yeah, that's always a tough question. I'm not going to say that we shouldn't ask that, because we should. It's precisely what we need to ask in some ways. Here's the better way that I want to. There are a lot of assumptions in that question that I think you're rightly asking for people that I'm not sure are correct. Let's talk about creation first and how God may create, and then we can ask that type of question. Because what I
Okay.
want to make the argument for is that for this, and now, oh Lord, I'm starting to sound like some of the sort of Christian philosophers that I'm not a huge fan of, but they're right, at least to a degree, on some of the free will stuff.
Like who?
Oh, like Plantinga. Actually, I do enjoy Plantinga to some degree. He's warm, but not in the sort of jerk way.
He's been a good messenger of theism as an actual philosophical
yes.
discourse.
I think it strays more toward Jersey Shore deism, but
yeah.
It's a different topic.
Yeah, definitely a different topic for a different time.
If God is the full, I mean, we talked about who God is already in some ways, at least in the philosophical sense. God is the fullness of activity, the singular concept that allows all other things to come into being and have identity. So we oftentimes think of life biologically, but we take out the intellectual component. Life is more than biology. It's to have an identity, and not in the way that we talk about identity today necessarily. It's talking about a God-ordered identity within the world. We are human of some sort, and that means something specific in the world, and it doesn't have to mean the same thing over time, but it's at least important to make these types of claims. So God creates, and the question is, how and why does God create? Well, the Christian answer is that God creates gratuitously.
Right.
God doesn't create because God needs to create, but does so for the sake of the creation, so that creation can be something rather than nothing, and find fullness of joy and communion both within itself through the divine Trinity, you could say. But God is also freedom, if you will, in the strict sense of the term. God is freedom in the sense that there is no distinction between who God wants to be and what God is. So we always make choices in this world because in some ways it will make us better, or we think it will make us better. It will draw us into a better identity. So we go drink so that we can get laid, so that we can, if you will, check a number off of our list and say, I got one more on my belt and I'm a better person for that, right? Exactly. Yeah, it's not a good ideal. I'm not saying live up to that one, but that's how we think of these things.
Do that, Mom. I'm not doing it. Promise.
And what we want to do in our freedom is say, oh, hold on, is that really what I thought was good? Right. I need to amend my notion of goodness, and then I need to create the virtues necessary for becoming good. So there's this discrepancy between who I am and who I want to be, and I have to freely, if I can, choose to become the person who I want to be, which is in accord, if you will, with God's will, which is nothing other than to live in the Garden of Eden, if in a perfectly ordered world.
Sure.
So God is freedom in the sense that God is who God wants to be. And whatever God chooses because it's in perfect accord with God's nature. I know this all sounds so self-confident and crazy, but this is just the type of talk that you get used to as you think through the classical tradition.
Sure.
What that means is there has to be freedom in creation. There has to. And God is constrained, I will even say, freely constrained to allow for freedom within creation, because creation is not just, it's gratuitous, but it's not just created willy-nilly, as if God's up there going, yeah, let's give the duck-billed platypus a bill. That'll look awesome. Right. But rather, God is imbuing creation with the very characteristics or reflections of God, one of the most important of which is this freedom. So
that is an incredibly profound thing.
It is.
I had not thought about that before. That's really cool. That like the reason that freedom is in the world is because creation is imbued with the very essence of God.
Yeah, I think so.
Wow.
I mean, the original
Huge,
St. Thomas talks about original justice. And this is why I call reason a prevenient grace. In original justice, which I think, again, the Greek Orthodox, people like Bentley Hart have hung on to in a far better way in many ways than the Western Church has. Original justice is this notion that the world was created with a specific order, and that order was already an incarnate one in part. So Christ would have come one way or another in and through the incarnation.
Sure.
And yeah, so reason is already, if you will, bound up with faith, and nature is already bound up with grace. It's just that there was no schism, no separating of these two. And you could call original sin the separation of faith and reason and nature and grace. That might be what original sin is, trying to take what is ours and make it our own, reason, as if it's not
what is not ours.
Yeah, it's
not ours.
Exactly.
Right, to take what is not ours and make it our own.
Yes, thank you.
So that in the Bible, is embodied in the serpent. Break that down for us. How does what we're saying here interact with the creation story, the creation metaphor, I should say?
Well, what we should do, we should talk about this in two ways. First, I want to talk about it through J.R.R. Tolkien, because yes, I am a huge Tolkien nerd.
Of course you are.
And second, we should talk about it Christologically,
okay,
and why I think this becomes important for understanding the first part of Bentley Hart's book. Tolkien is the best sort of immediate and visceral understanding of what evil is that I've ever read, and it comes in his, which is what all Tolkien nerds know as his sort of prequel to all of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit book. Now I can't actually, so I'm not that good with Tolkien because I can't remember the names of the gods, etc. Right? But he has this creator god who is the source of all being. He's very philosophically astute, by the way. He has this creator God who's the source of all being and begins to sing creation into existence. I love this notion of singing, this sort of outward expression of sort of beautiful harmony into what was previously nothingness. Out of the singing emerges the angelic host who sing along with God and continue, if you will, to unfurl a good and benign creation. And then one of those creatures, not liking the song, decides to put himself first and chooses a lesser good, his own will, over the divine good, which is the divine harmony of all things.
Right there.
Yep.
That decision is not something God is responsible for.
It's absurd.
Okay.
No, I mean, not that question.
Right, not the question, but the
decision is absurd. There is no explication of it. There is no way to decipher how and why this decision is made. It is merely privation. The best, Augustine tries to deal with it by saying, well, maybe some angels knew, for instance, that they would be caught forever in eternal bliss and other ones didn't, so they tried to get it for themselves. And he ultimately rejects this for reasons I can't understand. But maybe there's some reason that the angelic host thinks that it's necessary for him to sing in disharmony with the beautiful harmony of creation. But I can't give you any reason. It seems absurd to me. And
I'm not sure that's theologically sound either.
No, I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it that deeply, to be honest. Yeah. But it is at least a choosing of self over other, and a self over God, and a choosing of one's own desires for creation over and above what God has created this world to be.
Mm-hmm.
And the effects are disastrous, if you will, in classical Christianity, affecting, if you will, not only humans, but the whole of the world.
Right.
Let me make this a little bit more easily palatable to the contemporary Christian, because we have a hard time with that type of claim. So are you saying that the entire way that this cosmos has come into existence has something askew to it? Yes, I am saying that. And that seems absurd, and it should seem absurd until we go to Christ. So when we look at Christ, what we see, we oftentimes portray him as what I call the Norwegian hippie.
Right.
We talk about the dude who makes these nice aphoristic statements and that draws us into some sort of spirituality of love, and that's actually true. But the question is whether there's a cosmological order that supports love, or, if you will, hates love. Mm-hmm. So Christ is, as I talk about in my book, Christ is a radical Jewish prophet who's trying to draw us back into original justice, who's trying to draw us back into the created order as it was supposed to be. Those original creation narratives. Christ is recreating these in and through his life, death, and resurrection, resetting the world, setting it straight. But he does that through a particular means, and that means is the Roman cross. So when we look at Christ, what we're actually saying is that Christ is delivering us from the powers of sin, death, evil, by way of at least the world at the time. It's probably one of its most violent and politically salient methods of killing, the Roman cross. In other words, Christ is not only a critique. So let me put it this way. When Christ goes to the cross, he goes as the Prince of Peace, the true Prince of Peace, who refuses to do evil in light of evil, who refuses to commit violence in the face of violence, and rather takes it into himself somehow. Mm-hmm. And in that, he is critical of the entire Roman way of being and its reliance, if you will, on creating order out of violence. You could call it the Pax Romana. You could call it the Pax Americana. You could call it the Pax whatever. We all create order out of violence, and that is not the way of God. So Christ goes to the cross, and he opens up and shows the, if you will, evil of our ways politically. But now here becomes the important part that we have to ask ourselves. We at least proclaim in classical Christianity that God, the divine, unites fully with the human person of Christ, with the human nature of Christ, in and through the person of Christ. Mm-hmm. If we're making that statement, we have to take something seriously about ourselves. We are the capstones of creation. Now, we can argue that all day long and what that specifically means, but here's kind of what it means in the biblical tradition. We embody, for instance, rocks, in that if you throw us off a building, we fall. So rocks are caught up in the very physics, if you will, or we share with all rocks a certain physicality. We share with plants, too, a nutritive function in that we have to eat just as plants have to eat, and with animals, certain locomotive and emotional functions. And yet we take up all these various, if you will, levels of reality into our very being itself. And what my claim is this, is that in and through Christ, and through the union of the divine and human nature, there is also the taking up of all of creation, which means that also the cross is a critique of the way that creation has unfolded in a satanic, if you will, rather than benign function.
The way that creation has unfolded, not the way it was created.
Not the way it was created. Not
right.
The way.
So that's the leap that makes it compatible with a doctrine like creatio ex nihilo.
Exactly.
Which, for our lay listeners, means creation out of nothing. Which, by implication, means that creation is a God-given gift of grace.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we still see it in the creation. I look out at the mountain every day, and the beauty of God's creation is apparent to me, and it's always a signpost to the divine, as Augustine says. And yet, I'm under no particular, I don't fool myself. How have those mountains come to be? Violent quakes that have destroyed many beings, have caused much chaos, right?
Sure.
the whole of the evolutionary process is in some ways we call it what, selection of the fittest, right? Or survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest.
Selection. So that there's this massive amount of suffering and death and destruction that takes place just to find one single entity to live. Now, is it good that that entity comes to life and lives? Absolutely. And this is part of the creation that we affirm. And yet, I think Christologically, we have to ask ourselves, was it supposed to have been that sort of messy? And this is a radical statement, I understand that, but I think the cross and a proper understanding of human nature takes us here. And that's exactly where Bentley Hart, I think, is taking us in this book, because his question is this: should the tsunami have happened? Well, that's absurd from a modern scientific standpoint. But you don't ask whether it should have happened or not. That's stupid. The world is what it is, and we just have to deal with it. But his point is should the world have been, or did God set up the world in such a way that tsunamis would take place that would destroy millions of lives? And his ostensible answer, and I cannot answer for him because he doesn't ever say it directly, is no, this is not the way the world should have been.
Yeah.
Now, there's human fault, but there is also, if you will, a natural evil that we can see working its way through all of creation that ought not to have been either.
So what do you mean by natural evil? What's the distinction between that and human evil?
So human evil is when I see you on the street and for no reason whatsoever I kick you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just a human evil. It has a will behind it, in that I have chosen to do something for whatever reason. I've chosen a lesser good because I get some sort of strange pleasure out of kicking people.
A will to power, one might say.
Well, he interprets rightly, I think, the will to power as being found within nature itself. It's not really a will to power. It is a movement of power for its own sake, because things are no longer ordered as they should have been, or as they once were.
So is that what we're saying, natural evil? Is that a reactive property of the world to the difference that was created in human evil?
Well, I want to make the claim that human evil is a choosing of the world and what it had become over and above who God is and what God had called us to be. So I think that original sin in human terms is secondary, that there had to have been, if you will, the primordial satanic figure singing disharmony. And this is why I think Christ in the wilderness is so important.
Right.
Because Christ is being summoned by Satan to this primordial disharmony. And into the politics of Rome. And Christ is saying no to it all along. And he's going back constantly to Isaiah, and I think Isaiah 11, where he says, the lion will lay with the lamb, the child will play next to the den of the adder, which recognizes a cosmic peace that ought to have been in place. We're in crazy town. We have to admit, we're in crazy town for what we usually think in these terms, because we sum it up to human will. Absolutely. And what it means to exist. But Bentley Hart is too astute for that. He's saying natural evil, the tsunami killed, destroyed, caused massive amounts of suffering in the world. And we got two choices with this tsunami. And there might be more nuanced choices as well, but at least in this book, we're faced with two choices. Either God willed that tsunami for some reason, so as to bring about some greater good later on, and he talks about people who said that maybe we learned through the tsunami to have more respect for the divine. I mean, that kind of crap.
Yeah.
Or
that it's not just crap, it's bullshit.
I agree. Or the tsunami is a function of a primordial chaos that has emerged within creation that ought not to have been here. And we can say no to that chaos. And when the child dies by the way of the tsunami, we get to say, if we understand this, that shouldn't have happened. That was not the way things were supposed to be. Not if we look at things Christologically, not if we look at things biblically.
So the I just had this. I'm not. Oh yeah. So I'm not even sure that we can call it um primordial in a strict sense because it's not first,
It's not first.
and it's not in a sense elemental.
No, I agree. It's not supposed. It shouldn't be.
Even so,
It's
that natural, that that what we're calling natural evil itself is the reason we can't attribute it to God is because it's a secondary thing.
exactly. It's a secondary thing that emerges from the choice of a lesser good over a greater good. Self-will of maybe the greatest cosmic being over God's will, which was the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Or in ourselves, it's easier to understand in ourselves. Our choice of our worlds and our myopic projects and our ways of, so we get angry when we're sitting in freeway traffic, and I'm fully guilty of this, because damn it, it is our right to get back and watch Game of Thrones, which maybe we shouldn't be watching in the first place. It gets absurdly violent.
Yeah, you are correct. Don't spoil anything for me. I haven't seen any of the new season yet.
I've seen, I think, half of the
So.
show. I go,
Oh, what? You have to watch the whole thing, man. What's wrong with you?
it is, it plays to my worst possible propensities towards violence and these types of
Isn't
things.
that just what theologians do all day? Is watch Game of Thrones?
I hope so. I did watch King Arthur the other day. That was awesome.
The movie?
Yeah,
It was cool.
It probably wasn't objectively good, but that's exactly how I felt.
Yeah, no, it was. I thought it was a really interesting rendition of it.
Yeah,
Especially like the first half of the movie was really good. When they kept in the very beginning, when they kept like interspersing, the different just like moments in his life. That was really cool cinematography.
Yeah, no, it was fun. That was fun. I agree. So evil.
Anyways, yeah, sorry. I wanna take a second to go through each or see whether we can go through each of the different types, the different arguments that Bentley Hart cites.
Sure.
As ones that are fundamentally flawed and fundamentally not in keeping with Christian understanding. So this is page 27 to page 20, the top of 29.
Okay, 27 to 29.
So the first one is the Calvinist pastor, who is uncompromising on literal interpretations like I make weal and create woe, or and is so intoxicated by the grandeur of divine sovereignty.
Yeah.
Proclaimed that the Indian Ocean disaster, like everything else, was a direct expression of the divine will.
So this is the classical Calvinist way of arguing. Calvin talks about it and institutes in the following way. He says, if a tree branch should fall on you by accident, or what seems to be an accident as you're heading to work, I can't remember the specific example.
Right.
So what you shouldn't do is think of that as an accident. This is rather of divine providence. And if you're killed, that was of providence that you should be killed in that moment. Mm-hmm. And what Calvin is trying to ferret out here is the full idea of justification by faith alone. That if we are justified and there is no portion of us that commits ourselves to faith, everything must, if you will, be predetermined from all eternity so that some are justified and others are not. That's what he's trying to draw out. And the Calvinist pastor that he's discussing here is, yes, intoxicated by God's will, so that each and everything that happens, whether if you're trying to pee at night and you dribble on the bowl, that is predetermined by the will of God for some universal harmony that will be brought about in these. I know.
And the violent encounter that happens afterwards,
yeah, that's true.
In the morning when your wife sees it.
Touche.
So, even the dribbling is, we're attributing violence to God.
we are attributing our pee dribbling to God.
Right, and like that just seems not. And this is to a larger, a broader point, which is like to attribute the very trivialities of life and say that like God willed this.
And yet it's necessary
Like
from the,
we would never miss the bowl if that were true.
or or as Bentley Hart has noted, God is indistinct from a demon from Calvin's standpoint.
Yeah.
And God is indistinct from a demon from Calvin's standpoint.
Right. So when somebody walks, when you're walking down the street and somebody yells an expletive at you, yeah, that's God's will. It's like,
Yep.
no, it's not. That's not true.
I agree.
Oh, I did want to make this other point before we continue with that. Which is that do you think if the letters of John didn't exist, if we didn't have such a strong definition of God as love, do you think we'd be facing the same problems of Theodicy?
I would rather bring it. I'm going to make a nuanced argument here. The letters of John only make sense because of the life of Christ, as pointers to the life of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And if the life of Christ is always one that is bound up with a self-giving love, then we will always have had this. So, but without Christ, we wouldn't have. That's how I want to put it. Okay. So, on your question, yeah, without Joanna and understanding as it points to Christ, I think you're right. We probably have the same problem. There's just quite simply the philosopher's God then, who doesn't love, just is, and we can either accept the order of things or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's up to us. We can become Stoics or we can become Epicureans.
Yeah. So the second is another Calvinist, who, I thought this was funny. Explain that in the Augustinian Thomistic Calvinist tradition, and then Hart says, "For the sake of argument, let us grant this chimera a moment's life." I thought that was really funny.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
So this person says, God may have no need of suffering and death for himself, but suffering and death nevertheless possess an epistemic significance for us.
Yeah.
I think that just reduces God to someone who makes points.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's about right. So God is, we're dealing with when we deal with this Calvinist strain of thought, we're dealing with what I would call God of glory, right? So this is a glory theology. I can't remember what we call it. I have a whole, if anyone's interested, I have a blog on Tripp's website, homebrewedchristianity.com. I write a blog there called Catholic Corner with Eric Hall. And I have a blog that's called Theologies of Glory Suck Donkey Butt. And the reason is that it turns God into this.
That would be found nowhere else except for on Homebrewed Christianity.
I think that's very true. It turns God into this strangely solipsistic and self-involved being, whereby God has to get glory from us. And if we refuse to give God glory, well, God's going to make some points to show us that we ought to have done it by killing us, for instance.
Right.
And that's the type of argument being made here. Right. So God doesn't need death and destruction, but God wills it so that we know how weak we are and will come back to the divine and give glory where glory is due.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So the next one is a Catholic scholar and translator who's, I'm quoting here, whose work I greatly admire, invoking the holy innocents, glorying in our special privilege of bearing scars like Christ's. So first, tell us what the holy innocents are, and second, that seems like something straight out of Moltmann.
I'll be honest with you, I'm not a good enough Catholic to know who the holy innocents are. So we'll have to.
What is that?
We'll have to take that.
We'll have to.
Would it be Mary? Would it be Mary and the Christ child? We can Google this.
Yes.
Come up with a proper theological explanation. But yeah, I'm a I'm a bad Catholic in these ways. I don't know any of this stuff. I just know the intellectual history. Yeah. So, well, let's bring it to the essence of the argument, I think, that is being made. And this is something that's
wait, hold on. I'm looking it up right now. It's so the Holy Innocents is actually a day.
Okay.
It is the day of the massacre of the babies by Herod.
I do remember that now. Yeah. Yeah, we have I won't call it a celebration, but we have a mass dedicated to that. So
yeah, it's on the 28th of December.
Yep, that makes sense.
So, fun fact for all of you Protestants out there.
And Catholics, frankly.
And Catholics,
Here's the argument that's being made, and this is one that's frankly too often made in Catholic circles. Salvation is achieved by suffering, as if suffering is the goal in the end that we seek. Now, Paul, I think, is very clear about this. You should expect suffering if you engage in the Christian faith, but it's not the suffering that saves you. See, this is a product of our ways of envisioning Christ, that Christ had to suffer God's wrath, and in that suffering, God was somehow very demonically satiated and appeased the wrath, right? No. Suffering doesn't bring salvation, but suffering can be a very real, and we should expect that it is a real side effect of pursuing the true, the good, and the beautiful. So if we live a life like Christ, we should expect suffering precisely because, as Christ himself says, you're taking up a cross, you're going an extra mile, and you're turning the other cheek. And there is suffering involved with that.
Right.
The mistake, though, is to say that it's the suffering that causes salvation rather than the life lived in the order of God. Mm-hmm. Suffering, I mean, maybe the stub toe will be their new creation. I don't know. But there won't be the genocides and there won't be the tsunamis, if you will.
Yeah.
So I think that's what Bentley Hartz is saying is wrong with this particular notion.
Yeah.
It's just strange to speak for him, by the way. He can probably speak far better for himself.
I think at this point I've exhausted every David Bentley Hart lecture there is on the web.
Yeah, that's good.
I've watched so many of them.
No, yeah, I love it.
He's so good. Sometimes I just think about how good he is, and it just,
a little gasket. You just gotta go lay down.
It's not mine. Yeah, no, man, there's just something about him,
I know.
Also, I wanted to note this. I wanted to note that your metaphor, actually the Tolkien metaphor that you used of the disharmony, the resolution of that sounds a lot like the end of Jensen's systematic theology.
I don't know systematic, so let me put that as a check in the corner to
you gotta read it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Robert Jensen's systematic theology.
I like
it. Hart critiques a lot of it in Beauty of the Infinite. He also has an essay called The Lively God of Robert Jensen.
Awesome. Yeah.
The end is really good. And
cool. I'll pick it up.
Yeah. Robert Jensen is an interesting figure because he just has a way of speaking and a way of writing that is you just come upon a sentence and it's short and it's brief and you're like, wow, that was beautiful.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's great.
Like when asked, what he thinks heaven looks like, he was like, music.
Yeah.
Some sort of harmony.
Yeah.
It's this eternal harmony of music, and it's
he must be a Tolkien fan too.
Yeah, probably.
Not praise music. No.
No.
Do not. That's Let's
Not
do
praise
the next
music.
one because I unfortunately have to go to another meeting here.
Yes. I won't. Sorry. I want to be respectful of your time. And you've been on here for like way longer than you signed up for now. So yeah.
I love it. It's a blast.
Okay. So this last Catholic says that he makes providence sound like karma. And he argued that all are guilty through original sin, but some more than others, that our sense of justice requires us to believe that punishments and rewards are distributed according to our just deserts, that God is the great balancer of accounts.
It's sort of we may be able to think of God as the great balancer of accounts, but it's going to be all the more complicated than what we ever think of and think through, precisely because indeed, they are no more guilt-worthy than the rest of us from the standpoint of God. At least if we take as Bentley Hart is sort of facetiously pointing out, the notion of original sin seriously, then all are guilty and fall short. So it just doesn't work from its own presupposition that all are guilty. Unless you want to say that God doles out in time what is deserved in time. And, I suppose you could argue that way, but now all of a sudden you're making some strange proclamation that the poor people of Myanmar, or where was this, Thailand and Myanmar?
It was in Indonesia, I think.
Indonesia, thank you. Are being punished for sins committed, say, 2,000 years ago, as they've done nothing particularly heinous. Nothing like we've done, if you will, in both American genocide and American slavery. So
continuing American genocide.
Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, it's a very weak argument.
Yeah.
It's if you will, it's a deformation of Anselm's understanding of Christology.
I also think it's a reduction. God to the individual rather than God to the cosmos.
Sure, I think that's right as well.
If God is a balancer of accounts in any sense of the phrase, it's not my personal account.
No,
it is the account of evil and him, and that's the only account that matters.
Which plays itself out in and through individuals as well, but not in the way that we oftentimes, as I like to tell all my students, you are beloved by God, but you are not important.
Yes. You are swept up in the grace of Christ, but it's not just you who are swept up.
Sure, exactly.
Yeah, and I just want to end with this last little quote from it. This is on the last page of the first part, the 44. It says, Dave Bentley Hart is talking about Ivan Karamazov from Dostoevsky's novel, and he says that Ivan's rage against explanation arises from a Christian conscience. And so even if Ivan cannot acknowledge it, its inner mystery is an empty tomb which has shattered the heart of nature and history alike and fashioned them anew.
Let's end with that quote. Let's
Boom.
Because this is exactly where part 2 goes.
Yep.
Discussion of this.
Yeah. All right. Well, Eric, thank you.
Thanks, David.
As always, we will be in touch soon.